All right, we're continuing on with mechanisms of diseases. We're here in your anatomy book on page 117. So we left off here with pathogenic organisms and particles. So we're going to talk about the different kinds of things that can cause us to be sick. Okay, so the first one is a virus. A virus invades your cells and it has its own DNA. It has its own genetic makeup. And they are not living on their own. They have to, invade us to actually live. But they can replicate their own DNA inside of us and replicate their virus. Now, remember, a virus is not something that can be treated with an antibiotic. Okay? So a virus has to run its course. Okay? COVID is a virus. It has to run its course, but so is the chickenpox. So is the flu. It has to run its course. Now, we can treat the symptoms. We can make you feel better, but we can't get rid of it. Okay. So here are some different viruses that you may be familiar with. Measles, mumps, the flu, rhinovirus, which is your common cold. AIDS falls into there. Coronavirus, I want to point out, has been around for a long time. It is not new. What is new is COVID-19. That's the coronavirus infectious disease, and the 19 is for 2019. So coronavirus itself has been around for a long time, because what is a coronavirus? SARS, MERS, those are coronaviruses as well. Okay, but that is not what we have going on in our world right now. Okay, so with AIDS, human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, you probably know this first part. It's found in the blood, semen, or vaginal fluid of someone who's infected. It is transmitted through sexual contact, sharing needles because that's blood, or being exposed through either childbirth or breastfeeding, although we have a great survival rate for babies nowadays. Okay. With this, it infects the body, it destroys the white blood cells, which is the immune system. Most people who die of AIDS is dying from a complication that AIDS made them compromised for. Most people don't actually die of AIDS. When this first showed up in the early 80s, they didn't know what it was. Just like when COVID started, they didn't know what it was. And it took a while to diagnose because it was hard to see commonalities between people who had it. And of course, it started with homosexual men. It then started showing up in people who were IV drug users. And then the next group, let me go a step back. It was the early 80s. Those were two groups of people that really no one cared about. The politicians weren't on their side. That was political suicide if you were going to support IV drug users and homosexuals. It's a very different world today. If you did not live through it, it's very hard to understand exactly how it went. But the next group that got sick were hemophiliacs, which were people who needed regular blood transfusions because of their disease. These were not IV drug users, and these were not homosexual people. These were soccer moms and children and grandmas. And all of a sudden, wait a second, this disease that was limited to these groups of people is now in these groups of people. And then through sexual contact, they're spreading it to their spouse or maybe their baby is giving birth. And it grew from there. Okay. That's when testing became a big deal and they figured it out. Certainly there's no cure. There is a lot of treatment, and AIDS is not the death sentence it was in the 80s. People live with it for a really long time nowadays. Coronavirus, not a whole lot to say. I already talked about how it's not new. that it is spread through respiratory. That part is the same as COVID. And it's just how it attacks the body that is different through the different diseases. Next one is a flavivirus. Flavivirus, I like that word. This one comes from an infected bird to another animal or to a mosquito who then bites the human host. So it comes through your biting insects from an infected animal. This virus cannot come from the infected bird to the human directly. So let's say there's a dead bird in the ditch by your house and you pick it up and you put it in the trash can. That can't get you sick. It has to come from that biting insect in the middle. That insect is called a vector. A vector, V-E-C-T-O-R, and we talk about that later in the chapter, and yeah, you'll need to know that. So examples of flavivirus, yellow fever, dengue fever, West Nile, Zika, and you may have recognized some of those terms as ones that we like spray for mosquitoes because of the Zika virus or something like that. Yeah. The next one is prion, and let me see what note I put to myself over here. Prion is a non-living pathogen, and it's a protein particle. That's what I wrote to myself. Prion is actually a shortened term from proteinaceous infectious particle. Okay. And with this one, we are infected. Let me see what else it has to say. It doesn't have a whole lot to say about this here with prions. Different examples of this is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which we call mad cow, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which I don't hear a whole lot about. Okay, bacteria. So all of those were viruses up till now. Bacteria. Bacteria is a living primitive cell. This is the one that can be killed with an antibiotic. So if you have to get sick, these ones are better, okay, right, because we can kill it. And when a doctor is trying to diagnose a patient, we look at different properties that that bacteria has to try and identify what it is. And so the first one there says growth requirements. And so bacteria is categorized by whether or not they need oxygen, aerobic or anaerobic, oxygen or no oxygen. And so if we can identify if it's aerobic or anaerobic, it eliminates certain bacteria as being your diagnosis because it doesn't fit the criteria. Okay, the next one is called staining properties. And what they will actually do is like take a microscope slide and put a stain on it. And when we then look at it under a microscope, if it's stained purple, it's considered to be what's called gram-positive. If it does not show up in color, it's considered to be gram-negative. And certain bacteria are considered to be positive and negative bacteria. And again, we can eliminate certain ones from your diagnosis based on this gram-positive or gram-negative staining. The most common way, however, is to categorize the shape of the bacteria itself. So we put it on a microscope slide and we look at it under a microscope. What does it look like? I'm going to scroll down. There we go. So we have this bacillus, which looks like a rod, straight. Okay. And you can see it shows if it's gram-positive or gram-negative. So we could have some that are shaped like this. Some are positive and some are negative. And here's some examples of what diseases we're talking about. Anthrax, botulism, tetanus, salmonella, otitis, some respiratory infections. Okay. Some are positive and some are negative. Okay. The next one is this called the coccyx, which looks like little peas. And so they call it spear-shaped, and it's typically going to be a cluster. And again, positive and negatives staph, urinary tract infections, pneumonia, rheumatic fever, meningitis, gonorrhea. Okay. Yeah, just those 3 lines. Okay. So different diseases that you've probably heard of fall into this category, and that's what it would look like under a microscope. The next one is the curved or spiral rod. This looks a lot like the rod that we started with, but these ones are curved, where the rod is actually more straight. So the curved ones, I think they look like hot dogs, by the way. That's my opinion. And these all say negative. Cholera, diarrhea, syphilis, Lyme disease. Okay, those are all that kind. And then the last one is the small bacterium, and think of it as just like little specks. Again, those are all negatives. Rocky Mountain fever, Q fever, pelvic inflammatory disease, conjunctivitis, which is pink eye, parrot fever. Some you've heard of, some you probably haven't. Okay, so I'm going to scroll back to here where I was, and it runs through the pictures I just showed you. Okay. Not much else to say. Okay, we're going to talk about the term spore here. A spore is an inactive, dormant germ. So if the bacteria has turned dormant and turned into a spore, it can't be killed. Drugs, like an antibiotic, isn't going to kill it. Heat, moisture, cold, none of it's going to kill it. So this is where it might live on some surface that you could pick up, maybe ingest, put it, you eat something and you've got it on your hands, and maybe you ingested one of those inactive spores and it will reactivate inside of you. It can also be inside of you, turn to a spore and reactivate. Okay. This is part of why they tell you that you should take an antibiotic for the whole course of treatment, because if you take an antibiotic and stop when you're feeling better, you haven't really killed it, and that bacteria will come back with a vengeance. Okay, the next kind of, so we did viruses, then we did bacteria. So now we're doing fungus. Fungus is yeast and mold. And so yeast are smaller, molds are bigger, okay? And we call that a mycotic infection. In med term, myco, whoops, spell it right, means fungus, okay? So anytime you see something say it's a mycotic infection, it's a fungal infection, okay? So with a fungal infection, it can be kind of hard to treat. Antibiotic is not going to help. So you need like an antifungal. A lot of times this is going to be a cream, because a lot of times these are skin, like ringworm, jock itch, athlete's foot. Those are skin conditions that a cream is going to be used. But then sometimes medications certainly use. Thrush is like a yeast infection in the mouth. Babies get it a lot. I know my nephew had this when he was breastfeeding, and it was the worst thing in the world to get rid of. It was so hard for my sister to get rid of that. But we have other ones. Coccidiomycosis, sand yolk fever, aspergillosis, pneumonia falls into that, histoplasmosis. So some you've heard of, some you maybe haven't. Okay. All right, the next one, protozoa, is a single-celled organism. And so they are pretty self-sufficient, and again, kind of hard. We think of these as a parasite. Okay. So like an amoeba, looks like that. Diarrhea, dysentery, a brain infection. The flagellates have that tail that kind of whips around, and that makes it move. So it's not really swimming, but that tail kind of whips and makes it move kind of like it is swimming. Urinary tract infections, diarrhea, vaginitis, trichomoniasis. Ciliate has all these hairs which in other body parts we use the word cilia as those hairs, so that really helps. Those hairs help it move around, different gastrointestinal things. And then the sporozone, malaria, toxoplasmosis, diarrhea, some other things there. And here's your definition of them that can help you learn what those are. And then these ones, right, so these ones are actual parasites that have invaded our bodies. So nematodes, they are large, also known as roundworm. These are often transmitted by food or flies that bite. Okay. Platyhelminths are large, also known as flatworms and flukes. And then arthropods are your mites, ticks, lice, and fleas, also stinging wasps, bees, mosquitoes, and spiders. And I used this word earlier in the chapter. Those a lot of times are your vectors. Those are the ones who carry disease from a diseased animal to the human being. So let's talk about what those parasites actually cause in our body. And here's the different shapes of them. I'm going to get the arthropod off my screen till I have to look at that little bugger. So the nematodes you can see are like worm or snake kind of shaped. We see this with intestinal infections, trichinosis. Sometimes these are some of the things we might get from like eating raw meat or raw eggs and things like that. These ones are the schistosomiasis, snail fever, pork and beef tapeworm infections, and liver flukes. Fluke is like a worm. And now I got to put that ugly little bugger on my screen. The arthropods, those are your ticks and your mites. Oh, they threw in scorpions on that screen there. Okay. So those are the ones that can cause us disease there. All right, so we're going to end this video here, and we'll pick up with prevention and control with the next video. So now how can we avoid all of those things?